Hello, and I hope you've been enjoying the chapters I've uploaded. I put a lot of time and effort into them. Show your appreciation by commenting and liking the page to help my algorithm scores. Also hit that subscribe and notification to get my videos as soon as they're released. Thank you, I appreciate your help, and God bless.
Chapter 13. For Pete's Sake.
Pete, who will you challenge?
Jade replied, turning to Pete. The words were like a punch in the chest. I turned to Jade, blown away. Pete was my closest friend outside of Psy. To hear his name sent a shock through me. Judging by his demeanor, Pete had better things on his mind. He didn't even bat an eye. He was out of it. He stared out the window in a funk. It was the battle with Beth. I knew Pete. He rarely put his own affairs over others, and this was no exception. He felt he let Beth down, and it was written all over his face. She asked him to not give up on her, and he was a second away from doing just that. "Pete," I said, catching his attention. Everyone stared at him as he finally seemed to notice the attention was on him. I thought before he didn't care, but it was obvious he was too focused on his regrets to hear Jade's question.
What?
He replied, oblivious. The rest of the Legion continued to stare him down, surprised by his demeanor.
What's going on?
He continued. I hesitated, not sure how to say what it was I needed to say. You're the next up, I replied, pointing at Jade. He tilted his head slightly, showing a bit of shock before shrugging his shoulders in a submissive manner. Whatever, he uttered, turning back to the window. A moment passed as everyone tried to be understanding of what he was going through, but after he didn't speak for a minute or two, Jade was forced to finally press him.
Pete,
Jade pressed.
Who will you challenge?
He stared out the window, pausing for a second before responding.
Sean,
he replied, catching everyone off guard.
Sean?
Zek replied.
That kid's a monster. Why pick him?
I turned to Pete, seconding Zek's words with my expression. If this kid was the strongest fighter on their squad, he had to be ridiculous. Looking at Herschel and Cadmiel up close, they were beyond anything I could have imagined, and if this kid was better, I didn't even want to think about the possibilities of the danger Pete could be in.
Yeah, do you like losing or something?
Joe continued. Pete lowered his head in anguish. Something was written on his face that he wasn't saying. There was a method to his madness.
It's the only way,
he replied.
Jacob is a sure win. With Tim, Sai, and Uriah already out of the equation, we have Luke and Zek as major competitors. The rest of us are great pieces, but I don't know how we match up. It's a gamble. If I take out their top guy, it'll even things out and give us a better chance going forward. Nobody is stupid enough to call Jacob out, and with me out of the equation, the only matchup handicap would be Sam. Hypothetically, the rest of you will factor well against their remaining legion.
I gave him a simple look. Everything he said went over my head. He already had this planned, but the truth was, I didn't care. After seeing the brutality of Beth's trial, I didn't want to see my best friend fighting the top recruit of their squad. You decided on this from the beginning, I replied, pressing him. He nodded, still obviously affected by Beth's match. He was paying attention, yet half sulking in his response.
It was a deduction I made soon after Sai was put out, he replied. Besides, I think I can take this guy. I have a plan. I'm not going down without a fight.
Jade stared, stiff and emotionless. It was obvious he wasn't a fan of Pete's strategy, but it was his decision. There was nothing any of us could do about it.
I disagree, but it's your decision to make,
Jade asked, hesitantly waiting for him to change his mind.
This kid is probably the best recruit the Alpha House has ever had.
Pete nodded, stubbornly acknowledging Jade's words. We were still wrestling with the emotions of Beth's last match. The rest of us feared another lopsided battle. Beth had shown us the difference in their experience and ours. As talented as Beth showed herself to be, it was her experience that hurt her the most. Pete was brilliant, but so was this kid. The possibility of another one of our matches ending with a Legion member in the hospital was weighing heavily on the minds of everyone there. Yeah, are you sure? Jacob asked. He nodded solemnly.
It's for the team, he replied. Whether I win or lose, I still pick off their biggest asset. I'll put up a fight. I'll make the academy. The rest falls on you guys to win your match. It's a win-win situation.
Beth's last match and the brutality of it replayed vividly in my mind. Beth made it into the academy as well, but the cost was heavy. I couldn't stomach seeing Pete go through the same thing. These trials weren't a game. I couldn't let him do it. Pete, I get it, I replied, choosing my words carefully. You want to help the team, but this? You're not ready. None of us are. We're not ready for this kid. You saw what just happened to Beth. I don't think I can sit by and watch it happen to you. Pete shrugged his shoulder.
What do you want me to do? He replied. I don't want to do this any more than you want me to, but it's the best strategy.
He turned to Jacob and Uriah to back him up. They both hesitated, then regretfully acknowledged his words with a nod. You're a fearless kid, Uriah replied, and one of the smartest kids I know. You'll do fine. I'll make sure of it. Jake, what do you think? Jacob nodded, signifying he understood what Uriah was hinting at. Yeah, we got you, he responded. We'll be your advisors during the next trial. Their words filled me with optimism. Putting those two in Pete's corner gave him a chance. I was confident. Pete looked unfazed as he nodded appreciatively. Thanks, he replied. I'll come by your room to train after I visit Beth and Cy. Okay. Tim, you and Sam can join in, Uriah replied. Jade nodded and turned with a smile as he headed downstairs.
Well, then, there it is, Jade replied. I'll go and inform the council of your decision. I'll let you know your council scores later via BAU. As Jade walked off the bus, Pete turned to Max. I also want an undertaking as well. I want it whether I have the ability to admit it or not, Pete replied, sitting down and staring out the window. Max acknowledged his words with a nod before turning to the rest of us. We'll meet you guys tomorrow morning, he replied. But understand that these competitions can be brutal, even savage at times. Like I said when you arrived, we may be better, but the beings in this realm are not perfect. They are not evil. They have the ability to make bad decisions, and at times they let pride overtake them, but they are still good people. You guys have the unfortunate disadvantage of fighting in your earthborn bodies. They don't heal as quickly as the prospects' bodies here do. An injury that would take a couple of hours now takes days, and injuries that would take a day now takes weeks. It's something these people aren't used to. They aren't going to take it easy on you guys because it takes longer for you to heal. I'm saying this to ask you guys to be careful. We were lucky that Cy's mother gave us invaluable information that is going to speed up Beth's injury process. She still should be out for a couple of days, but she'll be back before the trials end. That's not always the case. So please, fight valiantly, but protect yourselves. He stood awkwardly waiting for a response before we all acknowledged his words with nods.
He fidgeted uncomfortably for another lasting second, then hit the side of the transport as he headed off out of it. The transport sputtered for a second, then began to move.
Phew, Zek replied. I'm happy that we're finally going to get to see Sean up close, but I wish it wasn't against Pete. I kind of like him. I don't want to see him get hurt.
I ignored the boys and stared out the window.
Yeah, I like Pete too. Sam would have been better.
Joe poked with a laugh. Whoosh! Sam let off a harmless flame toward the boys. They playfully dodged as Sam playfully shot it toward them several more times.
Will you two sit down and be quiet?
Danielle replied, agitated.
Come on, they're just kids, Sam replied. They have to be bored by all this.
Danielle turned to Sam with a blank look.
Well, take them in the simulator if you want. I need a break. They're driving me crazy, she replied.
You guys up for it? Sam questioned. I could use the practice. The boys lit up at the sound of his words. They trotted to the back as he followed them and disappeared into one of the portal rooms.
Finally,
Luke replied, exhaling as he turned to the window. The ride lasted a couple of minutes. We arrived in front of the hotel with most of us still in a haze. I was happy to see no press this time. I grabbed my bag and trailed Pete as he and Eve trotted, rushing to get to the MedCore as soon as they could to check up on Beth.
I'll meet you guys in a little while,
Pete replied to Luke, Jacob, and Uriah. They nodded, still corralling their bags. It seemed like everything was topsy-turvy. Before Beth's match, we couldn't take a step without the media putting a camera in our faces. Now our trail was bare. Was the media really that fickle? With one loss, we were already back-page news. I couldn't say I was sad to see them go. Eve, slow down, I replied, trying to keep up with her. Our trail to the elevator seemed to take seconds.
Well, speed up, she replied,
not slowing for a second. It's not like she's going to be there, I replied insensitively. She gave me an exhausted stare.
I don't care, Tim, she replied. I just need to see her.
I nodded, trying my best to eat my earlier words through my actions. Pete sat silent as the elevator finally arrived. The elevator opened, revealing M Delta 412 and his robotic smile. We all stepped aboard with a wave as he greeted us with the same robotic response he greeted us with each time we boarded the elevator transport. We need to get to the MedCore, I replied, as Pete and Eve leaned against the elevator walls, sulking. As the door pinged, signaling we made it to our floor, we all filed out. The med guys zoomed past us as we headed for Sai and Beth's rooms. Shai met us as we approached Sai's room. She wore a sympathetic demeanor.
Hi, Tim,
she replied, walking toward me.
Hi, Shai, I replied.
This is the med specialist that watches over Sai. These are my friends, Pete and Eve. She greeted both of them with a smile and handshakes.
Of course, it's nice to finally meet you, she replied. Tim is still kind of overextending my credentials. I'm more like a glorified assistant. You know, checking vitals and BAU feeds, nothing special. Although things around here have been pretty busy over the past couple of hours.
I surveyed the hospital as the workers zoomed around. Yeah, are all the injuries from the trials? I pressed. She shook her head irresolutely.
Well, yes and no. They are the reason for the volume of patients, but they aren't the only patients, she replied, looking around.
Eve stared around, surveying the layout, looking for Beth's room.
Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt or be rude, but do you know where my sister is?
She questioned, looking for her sister. Shai scratched her head as if to be pondering, then pointed just behind her.
Room 149, she replied. She's prepped. You can head in.
Eve nodded with a timid, respectful smile.
Thank you,
she replied, walking into the nearby room with Pete on her tail. Thanks, Shai, I'll be in to see Sai in a couple of minutes, I replied, following them. She smiled, acknowledging my words. There still hasn't been much of a change since last night, but I understand your need to see your little friend. I won't bother you. I just make sure you close the door when you exit, she replied, staring at a chart as she walked away. Don't want any more wind gusts knocking things over. When I finally made it into Beth's room, Eve was sitting at her side, holding her hand. She looked so peaceful. I'm so sorry, Eve replied, tearing up. She began to tear up as emotion overtook her. My heart went out to her. I was ashamed to admit it, but I couldn't work up sympathetic feelings for her. After the mean things she said to Beth before the trials, a part of me felt like she deserved to feel bad. I wrestled with the convicting, self-righteous feelings before coming to my senses. Eve was taking it hard enough. It was obvious she was condemning herself with a conviction I didn't need to match. Guilt was written all over her face as she stared at her battered sister. It's not your fault, I replied, speaking words my heart didn't truly feel in the moment. You couldn't have known. I turned to Pete for help, but he looked spaced out. He stared out a nearby window, playing with the blinds. It was weird. I knew the demeanor. He was holding back emotions. I saw him act that way once in his life. It was around the time his mother died. In my life, I never saw him so much as tear up. Whenever something bothered him, he either disappeared, clammed up, or became distant. There was no doubt in my mind. He was hiding emotions as he stared out into the beautiful heaven realm evening sky. Pete, are you okay? I replied, turning to him. He continued to stare out the window before turning to me solemnly. He barely showed emotion as he nodded. I'm fine, he replied, readjusting his backpack. He diverted his focus, trying his best not to look at anyone. His stare went from the floor, then to the ceiling. He would peek at Beth from time to time, but it was obvious he was afraid staring at her too long would stir up emotions in him. Are you sure? I pressed. Eve's gaze turned to him, seeming to be the straw that broke his facade. I'm fine, Tim, he snapped, sighing angrily. I'm just fine. Why wouldn't I be? Come on, you know me. You know what I'm feeling. Why do you keep asking me a question you know the answer to? I raised my hand in a relenting manner that caused him to show regret. I'm sorry, Tim. I know you're just looking out for me. It's just... I know how to deal when I pay for my mistakes. It's hard to reconcile someone else paying for them, he uttered, removing his glasses in a frustrated manner. Beth trusted me because I asked her to trust me. I made her believe she could win. I told her that if she believed in herself, she had a chance to win, because I'm smart enough to know the risk. I did everything in my power to prepare her. I crossed every T and dotted every I. I had to be right. Or at least that's what I had her believing. He smiled, blocking an otherwise chilling gaze as he stared me in the eye. I didn't know how to respond, as his words exploded from him like a plugged-up dam which was suddenly opened. Why wouldn't I be, right? He replied in a dry, sarcastic manner. I might as well have said to her, if you give up, you don't believe in yourself. No way, I replied, blown away by his take on the situation. No way, he chuckled facetiously. Fact, I told her to trust me. Fact, I told her that it didn't matter how much we believed in her, it didn't matter unless she believed in herself. You see me as a pretty intelligent guy, don't you? I was taken back by his words, not really sure about how I was supposed to respond. Of course, I replied. Well, then you should know that I have gone over this scenario from every angle, he replied angrily. Beth didn't protect herself and didn't give in because she believed if she did, she would have let me, Eve, and most importantly, she felt she would have been letting herself down. She felt she had to prove something. That's all Eve's and my doing. There's no getting around that. So, no, Tim, I don't want to be fine right now. I can't forgive myself for that.
I don't want this guilt I'm feeling to go away. So please stop trying to make me feel better about failing Beth. Neither of us deserve it right now. You told me to be cautious about overextending her, but my arrogance caused me to ignore your advice, and Beth paid for it.
Eve's face fell into her hands at the sound of his words. She began to sob at the sound of his words. I felt like I was caught in a brush fire, and I had no way to put out the flames. My head was spinning. I wanted to say they were wrong, but it would just be my take on the situation. That wouldn't be enough to change what they already believed. I replied, trying to cover two bases at once. Pete stormed past me, stumping out of the room more than noticeably agitated. I reached out to grab him. He snatched away from my hand and continued his path out of the room.
I deserve this, he replied under his breath, catching my attention as he slammed the door behind him. I wanted to trail him and press him on his words, but Eve was breaking down. I couldn't just leave her. Pete's words had torn the girl apart. First Sai, now Beth. We were dropping like flies, and Pete was on the chopping block. He had a huge task ahead of him. I failed Beth and Sai. I wasn't going to let another friend end up in the same position. Pete needed to focus. This situation was coming at the wrong time. We also needed Eve, but she looked like a shell of herself. What a difference a day made. Yesterday we felt invincible. Now, I wondered if we would even survive these trials in one piece. Eve, I replied, comforting her. Yes, you made a dumb mistake this morning, but the first thing your sister said was she knows you didn't mean it. You can apologize for those words later. That is not what you should be feeling guilty about right now. What you should be feeling guilty about is demeaning what your sister just did. Your sister deserves more from you two. So what? Who cares that she lost? She was awesome out there. She showed more mettle than anybody thought she had and went toe-to-toe with one of the top prospects in the trials. If they thought she was weak, I guarantee you they don't think she's weak after that. You're crazy if you think that wasn't worth it to her. She'll go into the academy with her head up, and she'll be fine in a few days. Eve dried her tears as she stared up at me in an appreciative manner. Just 2 months ago, I would have been stuttering, making a mess of things. But now, words seemed to come effortlessly. I wondered if my ability to decipher abilities gave me keener insight. Either way, it seemed to come to me like a sixth sense. Eve, she proved she was smart, courageous, and a beast of a remnant, I replied, rocking her playfully. She showed you're not the only one in the family that we don't want to get on the wrong side of. She chuckled, wiping the remaining tears. She blew me away, she replied, clinching Beth's hand and looking her over. She was always so timid. I've never seen her like that. She rarely competed and avoided most confrontations like the plague, but what I saw tonight, Tim, I wish you could feel how proud I was of her. I never knew she had it in her. I stared at the door, wondering how far Pete had gotten. Eve could see it written on my face. Go, she replied, ushering me forward. What? I replied, trying to play it off. I understand you're worried about Pete. I'm fine, she replied. He has a big day tomorrow. He needs your help more than I do, and I can tell you're worried about him. Go, look after your friend. I'm just going to sit here for a while. I shook my head, finally relenting and heading for the door. Thanks, Eve, I replied, turning back to her. Thank you, and don't worry. I'll stop by and tell Sai you said hi, she replied with a chuckle. I nodded with a smile. Okay, I replied awkwardly, almost closing myself in the door. She chuckled once more as I closed the door behind me. I trotted down the hall and impatiently tapped the elevator key. A minute or two passed before the floor bell signaled and the elevator door opened, revealing M Delta 412. I detected a slight disturbance in Peter, he replied. Is everything okay?
He seemed to be searching and struggling to use mannerisms that were foreign to him. It was weird to see him try and act human. He was still understanding things, and his pitch fell somewhere between creepy robot and innocent child. "Yeah, I'm sure you heard about the trials by now," I replied. "We're all a little on edge is all." His face went blank as he processed my words. "On the edge of what?" he replied innocently. I winced on the inside, fumbling, looking for an easier way to translate. "It's a human term. It means we're a little stressed out," I replied as the elevator door binged. "I'm sorry to hear that," he replied, trying his best to imitate empathy. It was a terrible attempt, but he tried his best, and it was a nice gesture considering the circumstances. I turned to him with a smile as I exited the elevator port. "Thanks, but we'll be fine," I replied. His trademark robotic smile appeared as he returned to a place of comfort. "I'm sure you will," he replied. "It's like you said, you humans need to feel as if you're fighting for something, and even if you have a slim chance at success, it's enough for you to believe in the impossible. They have you, and you have an ability to redefine the realm of impossible. I have no doubt that you and your legion will do well." A smirk showed on my face at the sound of his words. I felt like a big brother realizing his younger brother understood his words for the first time. I nodded, acknowledging his words. "Thanks. I really appreciate it, 412, I replied. He once again showcased his trademark smile as the doors closed. It was eerie that with all the humans around me, it took a synthetic to speak such humanizing words. It filled me with optimism as I made my way to Luke and Jacob's room. I walked a couple steps and turned, not confident that I was at the right room door. I stopped, backtracking, trying to remember exactly where the older boy's suite was. I singled down the choice to one of the two doors, but I still wasn't sure. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," I said, thinking out loud, randomly picking a door. A light enveloped me, and before I knew it, I was standing in the middle of a room similar to ours. I surveyed the layout looking for the guys, but I couldn't see anyone. I heard faint talking, so I followed the sound. "What do you mean?" said a voice that sounded unfamiliar. "Herschel is gone now. That makes me leader." A mocking laughter echoed at the sound of his words. "What's so funny, Abby?" the voice replied angrily. "To be honest, I can't decide," a female voice replied. "The fact that you think you could fill Herschel's shoes, or the fact that you are giving advice to a kid who is smarter and more powerful than you are." "Well, you've been useless since Herschel left. We need somebody to step up," he replied more arrogantly. "There's a reason why Herschel chose Abby to be the general instead of you, Kel," said a voice that I recognized immediately. It was Cadmiel. My heart jumped into my throat at the sound of her words. I accidentally entered into one of the ABA suites. I started to back out, but a part of me wanted to listen. Maybe there was something I could pick up on that could help me and Pete train. I racked my brain, thinking of a power I could use to help me in this situation. It only took me a second to remember Sai's invisibility trait. It took me a second to rewind her actions in my mind, but soon my eyes lit up as I could feel the light bending around me. I took a deep breath and walked into the room full of our adversaries. "Abby's only good at thinking things," a voice replied. The boy talking was the kid Kel from the beginning of the trials. He was lounging in a chair while two girls paced back and forth in front of him. I crept silently next to a chair and hid myself against a nearby wall. The BAU training I received in the simulation showcased itself as I barely made a sound. "That is literally the stupidest thing I've ever heard," Cadmiel replied, cutting her eyes at him. The girl I assumed to be Abby chuckled at the sound of Cadmiel's words. She was a beautiful girl with wavy dark black hair. She, like the rest of her team, was clad in a light trial robe. "Speaking about stupid, why did you do that in the last battle?"
he snapped. Go ahead and beat up the media darlings. That's about as stupid gets. You're just taking sponsors out of your own pocket. You think that looked good? He had a thick southern accent that made everything he said sound like his mouth was full of peanut butter. He wore a cowboy hat that hung low over his face as he sat back with his feet on a table that sat in front of him. He scratched his chin and chuckled as a toothpick hung loosely out of his mouth. That Nazarene bloodline is about as chaotic as a tornado, he replied. You never know what's gonna happen, but it sure is fun to watch, I'll tell you. Cadmiel stared at him with a look of disdain. You're an idiot, she replied flippantly. Besides, I practically begged that kid to invoke Paradosis. That's on them. She turned to Abby as if to be getting confirmation from her. Abby's gaze danced as if she was intentionally avoiding eye contact. Still, you need to control that temper of yours, Kel replied. Abby stared at the corner right next to me as if to be checking for someone. I crept closer, sure she wasn't looking at me, but still being cautious in my approach. Where's Sean? He's taking forever, she responded, looking at her watch. Knowing him, he's probably still signing autographs, Cadmiel replied. She chuckled to herself, falling back exhaustedly into a chair behind her with a slouch. How do you like that? I'm the one who gets the win, and they spend the night talking to him, she replied, playfully bitter. Abby smiled as she walked a couple of steps and peeked around the corner. Yeah, the only people close to that kid are those two Eli boys, Kel replied. Cadmiel took a deep breath as if to be picturing something in her head. Speaking of close, I'd like to get closer to that Jacob, she replied, pulling Abby's robe. That kid is too hot. Abby chuckled, shaking her head humorously. Are guys all you think about? She replied, checking her watch. Kel sat up and began to tap on the table like a drum. As he did, light alternated from the tips of his fingers, causing his fingers to make a bell-like tone with each tap of the table. You know Caddy, romance and fighting. Those are her two favorite pastimes, he replied, placing his fingers together and separating them, causing the light at his fingertips to play and look like an accordion. Oh, come on, Abby. Are you seriously saying that those kids from the Theta Delta Legion aren't hot? Not one? I understand the older kids, but that Tim, he's a little young for me, but he still should be on your dream list, she replied, leaning back. Abby cut her eyes and crossed her arms in front of her, shaking her head. My gosh, Cadmiel replied casually. Caddy, unlike some people, Abby is mature enough to focus on analyzing her opponent to pick them apart. You're too busy analyzing how kissable their lips are, Kel intervened. Well, excuse me for noticing a work of art when I see one, she replied, propping her feet on an ottoman that sat in front of her. She placed her hands behind her head as she lounged backwards. Besides, Abby's too focused on her new improved little friend Danielle, she replied, looking peripherally at Abby as she spoke. It's hard for her to think about anything else. Kel chuckled as Abby ignored the comment. Oh my gosh, now that was a coming of age, Kel replied, following it with an infatuation-filled whistle. Whew. Talk about hot. I didn't even recognize her. Abby's demeanor was visibly different as she shuffled uncomfortably as an irked facial expression slowly covered her face. You think you could put in a good word for me? Kel continued to poke insensitively. Cadmiel let out a provoking laugh. With the way those two fell out, you're better off speaking to her yourself, she replied. Kel turned to Abby at the sound of Cadmiel's words. What do you mean? Kel replied, sitting forward. What happened with you two? Abby ignored his comments and began to walk toward the front door. As she did, I turned to see a light emanating in the center of the floor in the shape of a door.
Slowly, two light bodies began to form until I could finally make out who it was. Sean stood standing with a kid half his size as the light dissipated. "Well, about time, superstar," Kel replied, rising to meet him. "Yeah, Sean, where were you?" Abby seconded, approaching him. Sean patted the head of the short kid standing next to him. The kid looked even younger than the twins. He wore a backpack that was 7 times the size of his whole body. He wore big glasses that covered most of his face. "Christian wanted to learn the Epilogue technique I learned a couple of weeks ago," Sean replied. They all stared at the kid as he sniffled and dusted himself off. The kid gave awkward a new meaning. He didn't say hi or even acknowledge the rest of the people in the room. "Is he supposed to be here?" Abby asked. "Like they would even find out," Kel replied, patting the kid on the back. "This kid is probably the best wormhole conductor at his age level in years. This kid could pinpoint a position on a plane flying at G-force speed." The kid was dry as dry could get in his demeanor. He didn't even look at Kel as he spoke. He just stared at Sean, focused on the boy. "All right, Chris. I'll see you in a few days, and I'll continue to show you the finer points of the technique, okay?" Sean replied. The kid didn't say a word. He just vanished as the rest of the Legion continued like they were accustomed to his weird behavior. "That kid is so weird," Abby replied. "He gives me the creeps." Sean shook his head with a chuckle and tossed his bag on a nearby chair. "He's a cool kid. He's just a little eccentric," he replied, sitting down. He relaxed, then stared at them as if something had just come to mind. "Why are you guys here?" he replied in a matter-of-fact type tone. Abby shook her head in a half-hearted manner. "The trials with the Selly kid," she replied. "We're here to figure out a strategy?" He rolled his eyes, playfully exhausted. "All right then, lay it on me," he replied, throwing his hands up jokingly. They all stared at one another, not really knowing what to say. "Well, we haven't exactly thought of one," she replied. "We were hoping you already had one." He laughed at the irony. "So what's the meeting for then?" he replied sarcastically. Abby shrugged apologetically. "Well, we do it for everyone else. It's just weird not to do for you too," she replied in an embarrassed tone. "See, I told you, Abby," Kel complained. "This is a waste of time." Sean grabbed his backpack and tossed it over his shoulder as he stood up. "Well, this has been productive," he poked. Abby shot a sarcastic grin. "Well, think of it this way. We have the utmost confidence in your ability to take care of yourself and do what's best for the team," she replied. "Well, apparently you're the only ones who think so," he replied, stretching. "What do you mean?" Abby asked, caught off guard by his words. He shrugged nonchalantly, cracking his knuckles. "I only got an 11 out of 12, he responded casually. They all sputtered at the sound of his words. "What?" Kel replied. "Are they serious? What did they dock you for?" "Yeah, what could you have possibly done wrong?" Cadmiel replied in a snarky tone. "Oh, great, Sean, the second coming." "Be quiet, Caddy," Abby responded. "We're just saying, if anybody deserved the first 12 out of 12 in trial history, it should have been Sean. I mean, there has never been a recruit like him in possibly ever." Caddy made a playfully sour face. Abby returned her gesture with a cut of her eyes before turning back to Sean. "It's no big deal. That one guy, the counselor from the Zebulon house, felt I lacked a solid sense of loyalty," he replied. "I guess he's right. I mean, I tend to be a loner in a lot of our missions, outside of Abby. I hate the Alpha House, and I'm a part of it. I wouldn't exactly call that being loyal. Let's be real. If it wasn't for Herschel and Abby, I probably wouldn't be here." I listened, and he was the complete opposite of what I pictured. He reminded me of, well, me. except he showcased more maturity and a level head. They all nodded, signifying they could understand the point he was making. "Well, regardless, what are you going to do about the Selly kid?" Abby pressed, changing the subject. "I don't know. I still got a lot of studying to do, you know? Looking at his techniques, habits, flaws," he replied. "I'm just getting in, but you guys are welcome to join me if you want." Caddy and Abby grabbed their bags and went to follow him. Cal exhaled, annoyed, following suit. "Go right in. I have to get something from my room and I'll be right there," he replied, pointing behind him. "All right. Hurry up, man. I could be lounging with the rest of the guys, but I'm here helping you out. Remember that," he replied, walking into the training room. "Yes, what would Sean do without you?" Cadmiel replied, shoving him forward as she followed with Abby on her hip, chuckling. Sean waited for a second, then stared at his watch. He surveyed the room before turning to me with a smirk. "Tim," he replied, sending my heart in my throat, "I know you're here." I crept lower, trying to hide myself as he walked over to me and tapped on a nearby table. "I'm a feel sense, and I have a memory like a computer," he replied. "I never forget faith energy, so I could feel you from the minute I entered. I'm guessing you're using Sarai's invisibility trait, but it doesn't matter. There is nowhere in this room you could hide where I couldn't feel you." I took a deep breath and released the bending light. He smiled as I slowly appeared. "Why are you in here?" he replied with a lighthearted chuckle. "It was kind of an accident," I replied, embarrassed and afraid of the consequences of being caught. "I was looking for Jacob's room, and for some reason your door allowed me in." He scratched his chin and walked over to the door, inspecting it. "Well, it's not hard to do," he replied. "It's all smoke and mirrors. These doors usually identify using a friend or foe algorithm, so if you're not a threat to the occupant. If what you say is true, and you truly did make a mistake and believed this was someone else's room, then it's not hard to believe it opened for you." I nodded, thinking it over. "So, I believe you when you say that you walked in by mistake. The question now is, why are you still here?" he replied, pressing me. I scratched the back of my neck, not really knowing how to respond without sounding like the biggest scumbag known to man. "Yeah, I'm sorry. I was worried about Pete. I was trying to see if I could maybe find some information to help him out," I replied. He cut his eyes at my words. "So, you were looking to cheat to get an advantage," he replied. I swallowed hard, looking away with my heart beating a mile a minute. His words made me feel like I was half a person. "I guess so," I replied, embarrassed. He smiled, trying to hold back his laughter before bursting into a chuckle. His actions caught me off guard. I didn't know if his actions were that of a guy putting me on or making fun of me. I stood staring as he raised his hands apologetically. "I'm just joking with you," he replied. His words calmed me as I smiled, trying to save face. I shook my head, embarrassed, but happy he wasn't mad. "So you're not mad?" I replied, trying to check to see if things were really how they seemed. He shook his head. "Am I happy to see you here? Of course not, but I can understand. If I saw what happened to your Legion mate today and had to worry about my best friend possibly facing the same thing, I would probably do what I had to do to prevent it as well. I may not have gone this far, but who knows?" he replied, placing his hands in his pockets as he spoke. I couldn't believe he could be this good of a guy. I stood, nodding in disbelief. "So, what happens now?" I replied, willing to deal with whatever punishment he saw fit. He shrugged and pointed to the numbers on the top of the door. "Remember those numbers, and don't come here again," he replied. "Other than that, don't worry about it. I'm not going to say anything." I nodded with a smile. "Gotcha. Thanks," and I really am sorry," I replied, walking to the door, still embarrassed. As I approached the door, Sean called out from behind me. "And Tim, don't worry about Pete. Regardless of the situation, I can incapacitate him without putting him in a coma," he replied. "He's a strong and brilliant fighter, so I can't promise it won't get hairy, but I'm not catty. It won't go that far." I nodded, appreciating his words. "Thanks, Sean. You're a good guy," I replied, feeling peace from his words. The worry that had dwelled in the pit of my stomach since Beth's match had vanished. I was actually excited to see Pete in a true gentleman's battle. I trusted Sean's words wholeheartedly. "Thanks, but it doesn't take a good guy. It just takes someone who still understands what it's like to be human," he replied, "and a Christian." I nodded, not fully understanding what he meant. I really didn't care. I was just happy it wasn't going to be a bloodfest again. I gave him an acknowledging salute as I exited. He smiled as I disappeared in the light. I appeared in the hallway, knocking Danielle over. "Tim?" she replied, staring at me, surprised. "Where have you been?" I helped her to her feet. "I went into the wrong room," I replied, dusting her off. "Oh, is Pete with you?" she replied. "No, I thought he was with Jacob, Luke, and Uriah," I replied, more asking than telling. She shook her head, surprised by my response. "No, they thought he was with you," she replied. I tensed up at the sound of her words. Where could he be? I thought, retracing the events that had transpired minutes earlier in my head. "He isn't with me. The last time I saw him, he was leaving the Med Corps," I replied. She looked at the floor, thinking for a second, then shrugged. "This doesn't make sense," she replied, shaking her head. "Let's go find your brother." I agreed, trotting with her. We walked up to the door. It scanned us as I tapped my foot impatiently. The light covered me, and I ended up on the other side of the door. I stood blown away with the suite. It looked like a palace. I walked around, staring at the walls in awe. "How did they get this?" I replied, pointing in no direction in particular. She shook her head, annoyed. "Never mind that. Let's just find the boys," she replied. "That's not important right now." I stared around like a kid throwing a temper tantrum internally as we walked the huge palace-like inside. It had more rooms than I could count. It looked like one of the mansions from the magazines. It had pure golden walls with pearly white tiles on the floor. I stared out the window. It sat on a cliffside looking over a beautiful ocean waterfall drop. I couldn't believe it. Their room made ours look like a motel suite. "Jacob," Danielle responded, turning a blind corner, "I found your brother." As I approached, the whole Legion was standing in the middle of the simulator room. Sam trained while the rest of the Legion looked worried, standing around. They perked up at the sight of me. "Tim," Zek replied, running up to me, "we thought a wrath demon got you." "Yeah, that or maybe you were lost. You know, because you're stupid," Joe seconded. Zek elbowed him hard, causing him to recalibrate. "I'm sorry. I mean, we thought you got beat up," he replied with a fake smile. "Thanks for your concern," I replied, not sure how to respond. "Move, you two," Luke responded, nudging the boys to the side. "Tim, where were you?" Jacob responded, checking me up and down. I sighed, not wanting to go through the whole story. "I came from the hospital and went to the wrong room," I responded. "Well, it was kind of more than that. I sort of tried to eavesdrop on the Alpha Beta Legion and got caught." Jacob sighed, throwing his hands in the air in anguish. "Tim," he grunted. "What? It was fine. Sean was the only one who knew, and he was cool about it," I replied, trying to calm him down before he started. "He even sort of gave me his word that he wouldn't hurt Pete." Luke's eyes opened wide as he stared at me like I was the world's biggest idiot. "So, you snuck into the guy's room and begged him not to beat up your friend. So lame," Luke replied, piling on with an exhausted sigh. "No, I didn't," I responded. "So, what did you find?" Uriah asked, cutting me off. "Well, nothing really," I replied, embarrassed. "Wait, what does that mean? Nothing really?" Jacob pressed. I sighed, coming clean. I didn't find anything at all," I replied. "I just heard a conversation between that kid Kel and the two girls, Abby and Caddy." "Abby?" Danielle replied bashfully. "Dude, I know you're a kid, but man, you do some stupid things," Jacob replied, shaking his head. "Do you realize you could have cost Pete his trial if that kid would have turned you in? Do you ever think before you act? Just once. I'm serious. Just once." He looked like he wanted to swat me like a fly. I ignored him with a grunt as I scanned the room. "Whatever," I replied. "Anyways, none of you know where Pete is. I mean, are you sure he isn't in our room or back at the hospital with Eve?" Uriah shook his head. "No, we tried all those places. We asked Eve in the hospital, and Luke transported to Sai's room," he replied. "We can't find him." I shook my head, picking my brain, trying to think of where he could be. "I'll go and check the hospital again," I replied. "Maybe he's gone back since you checked." "Why go all the way back there?" Luke replied. "We'll just contact Eve from here." "No, I need to check some other places on the way," I replied. "You can give Eve a heads up, but regardless, I'm going to check the grounds myself." They all nodded as I turned to leave. Danielle hesitated for a second, then responded. "I'll go with you," she responded bashfully. I wanted to ask why, but she looked embarrassed enough, so I just ignored my suspicion. "Sure," I replied, not really knowing how to respond. "We want to go too," Joe added. "No," Danielle let out, sarcastically extending her response. "Maybe one, but both of you are not coming." "Joe, you go. I'm going to teach Sam some more moves anyways," Zach responded. "Okay, see? No problem," he responded with a gushing smile. "Okay," I responded. Danielle rolled her eyes as we turned to leave. It was good to know they were coming. They knew a lot about the Heaven Realm, and I was going to need a crash course to find Pete in enough time for him to get good practice before his trial. The clock was already working against us as it was. "So, do you know where he is?" Joe replied, tilting his head as he spoke. I lowered my head and readjusted my bag before turning to him, dumbfounded as we walked. "If I knew where he was, there would be no need to look for him," I replied dismissively. "Oh, yeah," he replied. He seemed to be happy just doing anything other than sitting in his room. He walked, bouncing with every step as Danielle seemed distant. She stared around the lobby in a haze until I caught her attention. "Do they allow you out of the hotel during the trials?" I replied, turning to her. She shook her head as she continued to survey the layout. "It has to be approved by the council, technically, but unless it's a true emergency, such as the second coming of Jesus, they don't approve anyone," she replied. Joe was still wearing his gold and white trial robes, with one strap of his backpack from earlier in the day over his shoulder. "Where do you think he is?" he asked. We rode the elevator and walked in silence for 10 to 15 minutes, and the awkwardness was at an all-time high. I ignored the two of them, looking out the window, trying to cut some of the tension. I could see the city from the hospital windows that looked out on it. It was beautiful. The gateway we noticed when we first arrived was considerably smaller. There was a golden expressway that cascaded, rolling through it, showcasing a beautiful countryside on the far northern side of the city. It looked so peaceful and organized, a stark contrast to the chaotic hustle and bustle of Angel Haven. "I have no idea where he is. We've checked in all the places we thought he would be," Danielle replied. Danielle stared at a hollow screen that she switched on after we walked out of the elevator. I didn't bother asking what it was. I assume it was some type of homing device. "You're his friend, right, Tim? You should know," Joe continued. "I mean, you two are like brothers. If it was me, I would know where my brother was." I stared at my watch, tapping it like a brute caveman. I shook my head, slightly embarrassed. I knew it was sad, but I was tempted to lie just to save face. But it just seemed wrong considering the setting. "That's because it would be impossible for him to ever lose you," Danielle pressed, "seeing as you two are always locked at the hip." "We're separated now, so, he gestured, grunting immaturely. "Yeah, and it's killing you," Danielle replied, causing him to stop and think about it for a second. "Well, he's my brother," he replied with a playful smile. Danielle rolled her eyes before turning to me. "Tim, I hate to say it, but maybe he's right. I mean, you have known each other your entire lives," she replied. "You can't think of a place. Obviously, you don't know a place here, but typically, what type of place does he generally like to go to?" I shrugged, then thought about the question for a second. I tapped my foot for a second or two and perked up just as I was about to give in. "Is there a library here?" I asked, turning to her. She took in my words with a blank expression before turning back to her hollow watch. She thumbed through an invisible screen before turning back to me with a smirk that fell between a satisfying and arrogant smile. I paused, not really knowing how to respond until she finally replied. "Got him," she stated. I nodded with a smile of my own. "Okay, let's go," Joe replied, sprinting toward the elevator. Danielle exhaled, exhausted, trying to grab him before he sprinted off, but he was too quick. "Joe," she replied, narrowly missing him, "slow down." He shot down the hall, narrowly missing several droids before turning around to respond. "I'll be fine," he protested, offended. "Joe, look out!" Danielle yelped. Wham! I gasped as he crashed flush into a group of kids. I shook my head, noticing who it was right away. "Hey, kid," said a boy, picking himself off the ground angrily. It was one of the Alpha Betas. Joe smashed into a kid I recognized from the trial banquet and narrowly missed Abby. He knocked dirt off his pants angrily, staring at Joe. He reached up and grabbed him with one hand. "Put me down," Joe replied. He slowly stood up, holding Joe, extending him like he was a torch. I stood watching, not knowing what to expect, but knowing I had to react. "Hey kid," I shot forcefully. "I'm sorry he ran into you, but he's a kid in my legion, meaning his problem will become yours if you don't put him down." He smirked in my direction. I noticed a faint bit of light energy fluctuating in his spirit. He was powering up. I gasped on the inside, not fully understanding how I was supposed to handle the situation. "Make me put him down," he replied, his eyes clearly beginning to power up. Flash! I flash-stepped forward, snatching Joe from his grasp. He looked around, surveying the layout, dumbfounded, until he finally located me. He smiled, staring at his hand, pleasantly impressed, before stoically turning toward me in a threatening manner. "Don't do that again, Eli," he warned, staring at me angrily. I pushed Joe behind me in a shielding motion as I stepped forward. "Keep your hands off my Legion mates and that won't be a problem," I shot back, anticipating further conflict. "Move, Tim! I can handle this nug nutso!" Joe replied. I blocked him just as he was about to power up. "Joe, don't," I replied. You don't need to do anything that's going to get you disqualified. You still haven't done your trials." He whimpered, disappointed, before shooting a sneer in the kid's direction. "It was an accident, Benjamin," Danielle cut in. "Let's not make it more than that. We both have trials, and there's no need to get disqualified over something as stupid as a kid mistakenly bumping into you." Abby tensed at the sound of her words. She stared at her like she was looking at a ghost. The atmosphere between her and Danielle was cold. Danielle tried her best to not look her in the eye as she spoke, but the awkwardness was apparent in both of their faces. "Danielle, you have reason to talk. You know you don't give two craps about this kid. What are you trying to prove? When have you ever cared about anyone other than yourself?" Benjamin fired. "You stuck-up brat. This has nothing to do with you. Go call one of your daddy's guards and leave the fighting to the real prospects." Abby raised her hand, stopping him in mid-sentence. "That's enough, Ben," she demanded. "Let's just go." He looked toward her with an offended glare before nodding obediently. He gave one last childish sneer before turning away. "Abby?" Danielle replied, catching them as they turned to leave. Abby stopped without turning around as Ben continued down the hall, peeking back for a second before ignoring the exchange as he headed to the elevator. "What?" Abby replied coldly. Her demeanor seemed to cut Danielle as she hesitated before continuing. "Look, what I said that day, my words," she muttered bashfully, "I was wrong. I was hurt and I didn't know how to deal with things. I felt you were going to desert me and leave me all alone again. It isn't an excuse for what I said, and even if you hate me forever, I just want you to know I didn't mean it. You were a great friend and I shouldn't have said what I said. If I could take it back, I would." Abby stared at the floor blankly. It was hard to get a read on her emotions from where we were positioned. She continued to stand with her back to the girl. "It's too late, Danny," she replied. "You've had years to tell me that. In fact, I waited for years to hear you say it. But the truth of the matter is, I know you well enough to know how you think. Yes, it's possible that you are contrite about what you said to me, but it's also likely that you see me as a target and you're messing with my head. It's what your father taught you and what you taught me. Always be the smartest person in the room, right? Control the controllable. I'm sorry, but I don't trust those words after all this time, especially amid the chaos of light guard trials. Before I would have known better, but now, I just don't know." She paused, staring at the sky. Danielle nodded, acknowledging her words. "I know, and I wish I could prove it to you somehow," she pleaded. Abby turned, staring her in the eyes for the first time. "You can," she replied. "In all my years doing this, I have never met an elemental as good as you are. You're the best. I know that, but these guys don't. If you end up in the final face-off against me, respect me enough to give it your best. The only one that can bring the best out of me is you. I need to make it into the academy, and you can help me by letting me see how good I have really gotten. Afterwards, we can talk about the past. But as for now, stay away from me. That's all I ask." Danielle nodded as she turned to leave. "Okay, you have my word," she replied, wiping thin tears from her eyes. Abby seemed visibly emotional as well. It was a passionate exchange that seemed to give Danielle a bit of closure. Abby nodded as she headed toward their elevator as Ben stood waiting on her. "Are you okay?" I pressed, as Danielle seemed visibly shaken by the exchange. She nodded, exhaling as if the weight of the world was lifted off her. "Look, just head back to your room. Joe and I will head to the library and meet up with Pete," I replied, as Joe stared at me, happily jumping up and down. "Yeah!" he replied, yelping like a hyena. "Are you sure?" she replied, composing herself. Yeah, we've already found him. You've done your part, I replied with a smile. And for what it's worth, that was pretty cool. I mean, you must really care about her to let down your guard like that. She smiled with a nod. Wouldn't you do the same for any of your friends? She replied. I hadn't thought about it like that. I couldn't imagine being on the opposite side of Pete or Cy in a competition as violent and important as this. The resolve it would take. I didn't envy her position at all. Now Abby's words rung more clearly. She wasn't only telling Danielle to give her best, but she was explaining the dilemma she was in as well. It was an impossible situation for both of them. Yeah, I understand, I replied empathetically. Well, thanks for understanding, she replied, giving me a hug. Get Pete ready. I need to sort things out, but I'll be okay. I just need to find a nice soft couch and just mellow out for a while. Tell the guys I'll meet up with them tomorrow. Okay, I replied. She grabbed her medallion as it lit up. Wait, you can use those things here? I replied. She smiled, holding it out with an exhausted look on her face. So, you've been using the elevator to get around, she replied. Makes sense. No wonder that droid was so friendly. Yeah, I replied, looking away bashfully. He's okay, though. Really? A droid? She replied. You even became friends with a droid. What is with you? Do you find a way to befriend any and everything you come in contact with? I shrugged humbly. She smiled, extending her medallion in a demonstrating fashion. Yeah, it's only for the pre-trial stuff, and once activated, you can only move inside the resort, but other than that, it works a lot better than the elevator, she responded with a smile. See ya! She gave me a pat on the shoulder as she disappeared. Joe stood looking me over, holding his medallion in one hand. I thought we were only not using these things because you wanted to search everything yourself, he replied. It was annoying. But enough talking, you two. Let's go get Pete. The boy pulled me away from Danielle in a yanking motion. I smiled, shaking my head as we both waved goodbye to Danielle. I locked in on Pete's faith energy, and instantly my medallion began to light up. Before I knew it, I was standing at the entrance to the library. Why would anyone want to come here? Joe muttered. We stood in front of a check-in desk with a bird-nosed droid sitting at the counter. She looked like a librarian from the 1960s. She was elderly with an old vest sweater and a button-up shirt. She sat at the desk, looking down her nose at Joe. Children are not allowed unless accompanied by an elder prospect, she snarled, looking at Joe like he was an insect. I have one, old lady, sheesh, he replied, pointing at me. She stared at me, then back at Joe in a disapproving manner. What is your business, Mr. Eli? She replied with a rickety smile. I forced an awkward smile in return before responding. Is Peter Selly here? I asked, staring around. It looked more like an oversized warehouse than a library, a space-age warehouse. There was a lighting strip that cascaded down each aisle. It was all black and a clear diamond-like stainless steel. The books looked like glass frames. Students pulled them out like CDs in a deck. Ah, Peter Selly, you say? She replied, squinting. A glass holograph screen rose from the desk as she moved her hands, filtering through the library database. Yes, Peter Selly. He is in the mechanical engineering section. Just a second, she replied, hitting a couple buttons on the screen. Follow this arrow and it'll lead you right to him. As she spoke, an arrow, much like the arrow that guided us during our training, appeared blinking inches in front of my feet. Joe moved his feet, dodging the arrow like his feet were on fire. Young man, stop that, she replied, glaring at him, annoyed. Joe shot a playful, mischievous smirk as he stepped one more time just to get under the droid's skin. "Come on, Joe," I replied, grabbing him. "Hey," he replied as I dragged him as I walked. "You've already almost got us all kicked out of this place once," I replied, waving to the librarian droid as she stared at Joe like a stain on her beautiful utopia. I waited until I was a safe distance away from her before I let him go. I continued to follow the arrow as it took me down a hallway, knifing in and out of prospects. They all stared at me, starstruck, as I smiled, trying my best to not seem stuck up. The arrow finally halted and ceased to blink in front of a book tab. "How do I use this thing?" I replied, tapping it like a Neanderthal. "It's a book," he replied. "You have to open it. It's like another world almost. These instructional ones are like warehouses. Pete must be building something." "Wait, are you serious?" I replied, staring at him. "Yeah," he replied. "Look." He reached out and grabbed the book as an electric charge sparked, then engulfed us in a bright light. When the light disappeared, we were standing in what looked like a futuristic body shop. "See?" Joe replied, pointing in a direction. "Whoa, what's that?" I followed his eyes and paused, looking at a monstrous-looking robot gorilla. Pete stood on a crane-like platform with a blowtorch-like tool. It was humongous. "Pete?" I replied, squinting. He turned around, surprised to hear my voice. He raised his goggles with an apologetic demeanor. "Hey," he replied, gun-shy. "What are you doing?" I replied angrily. "And why didn't you let us know where you were?" The platform lowered as I stood waiting impatiently. He wore a body shop coverall that he had halfway unzipped. "It was sort of an accident. I was just thinking it would be nice if there was a library, and next thing I know, I was staring at this book. I opened it up and I ended up here," he replied, showcasing the place like a hand model. "What is that thing?" I replied, pointing at the huge robot. He turned to it with a proud smile. "You like it?" he replied, backing up as he pointed to it. "I don't know what it is," I replied. "Whatever it is, it's awesome," Joe added, tapping on the robot. "Hey, be careful," Pete warned. "It's not finished." Joe pulled his hands back apologetically, like the robot was hot. "Well," I replied, "what is it?" He smiled even bigger than before. "Remember your fight with that kid Herschel?" he asked rhetorically. I nodded, not knowing where he was going with his statement. "Well, this is my law-vert version of that," he replied. "This is Lex." I stared, confused by his words. It was nothing like Herschel's beast. It was big, bulky, and metal. "Okay, explain," I pressed, looking at him. "Well, obviously I'm not a percept vert," he replied. "But I think their ability to summon these beasts is a valuable asset for a thinker like me. I'm an okay fighter, but my ability to command is my biggest strength. Give me 4 or 5 of these guys, and I can hold my own against anyone, even you." I stared at him, shaking my head. How did I ever doubt that this kid had something up his sleeve? He was right. If he had an army, then it became a game of wits, and you would be hard-pressed to find anyone on Pete's level in that regard. But Herschel's beast had a mind of their own. They had instincts. They were like real animals, I replied. This thing looks like it's an empty vessel. Besides, how are you going to bring these things into a fight? Look at this thing, it's huge. He smiled, holding his hand out with 4 pill-sized capsules. "That's why I'm the only guy who can pull this off. My unique ability to control the mass size of anything I touch helps me compress them small enough to fit into these capsules," he replied, holding one of the capsules between his thumb and forefinger and kissing it. "And as for the intelligence, that's where this library came into play.
This place is a utopia of knowledge. I got the idea to do this whole thing after your trial. I knew that I had the ability to physically create my own war machines, but it wasn't until I got here that I was able to research the artificial intelligence that the droids used. I added my own twist on it to add battle instincts. It wasn't easy, but after a little while, I perfected it. Now my war machines can take on any percept beast, and I'm the only one able to do it.
I shook my head, astonished by his intelligence. He used everything. That was the Pete I knew. Every experience at his disposal was utilized, every minuscule detail dissected and perfected. He was a true genius.
Awesome,
Joe replied.
Can you make me one?
Pete shook his head with dry in his exhaustion.
Didn't you just hear me say I'm the only one with the ability to change their mass enough to fit them in my capsules?
He replied, shaking his head.
Oh yeah, and I haven't shown you the best part yet.
I stood standing as he jogged over to the foot of the robot. He lit up until he looked like a mini star, then dispersed like an electrical charge. As he did, the light in the eyes of the robot lit up. I stood as the machine came to life.
How do I look?
The robot replied, moving its hands. I squinted, trying to verify if what I was seeing was what I thought it was. Pete? Is that you in there? I replied. The robot nodded, to my surprise. As quickly as it came to life, it fell lifelessly as the electricity shot from it and converged back into a mini star. Slowly, Pete came into view as I stood, shielding my eyes from the light.
You know how us verts can break our matter down to the light level in order to travel in time,
he replied, walking towards me. I think, I replied, racking my mind to remember. He cut his eyes at me and shook his head.
Well, we can. Anyways, light energy, as you should know, is just electricity. It's what gives us life. Therefore, I can transfer myself into my war machines anytime I want with that ability,
he replied, pointing behind him with his thumb. I nodded, forcing a smile, not really knowing what to say. I wasn't sure I totally understood it, but after the mental feat he had pulled off, I was embarrassed that I couldn't even grasp a simple concept. Well, sounds good to me, I replied. Can I help out? He stared at the robot for a short second, then shook his head.
I'll be done soon,
he replied.
And what I have left over, no offense, but it'll probably be best if I do it myself. It's been a long day for all of us, and I have an even longer one tomorrow. Let's just call it a night, and I'll see you guys in the morning.
I nodded, feeling useless. I was happy he had an ace up his sleeve, but I still wasn't confident it would be enough to beat Sean. I walked over to him and gave him a high five, pulling him in for a hug. All right, don't stay out too late, I replied. I'll see you in the suite.
Oh man, I wanted to see how you did it,
Joe groaned, slumping. Pete rolled his eyes in a relenting fashion.
All right, follow me,
he replied, ushering Joe toward the robot. Joe stared at me like he was asking for my permission. I nodded, giving him the okay as he smiled from ear to ear and skipped after Pete. I grabbed my medallion, and before I knew it, I was standing in my bedroom. After what Pete had shown me, I should have had more confidence, but I was still nervous and afraid. Pete was game, and Sean had given me his word that he wouldn't put Pete out of commission, but I had a sweeping suspicion that things